Welcome, everybody, to a very important show dealing with the most important issue facing our country and the entire world, and that, of course, is climate change. And we are delighted to have on the program Bill McKibben. Bill is an old and dear friend of mine. He lives 35 miles down the road in Ripton, Vermont. Bill wrote his first book on climate change called The End of Nature way back in 1989. And he's been out there year after year explaining to people all over the world what climate change is going to do to our planet. But not only as a writer, he is an extraordinarily good organizer, one of the founders of 350.org. Bill, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, Bernie, many thanks to you. And, I just really want people to know before we start, because you won't say it, but you've been on top of this issue for a very long time. You and I started going around to your Sunday morning town halls across Vermont 25 years ago and talking about these issues back when there was no one in the US Senate talking about them. And you have kept it up to the absolute last minute. So many thanks.
Well, thank you. And you have been a mentor to me on many of these issues. All right, let me just bore people for a few minutes and go over the reality of what is happening not only in America today, but throughout the world. And it's important that everybody understands this. The last 10 years have been the hottest on record. Each of the last 13 months have been the hottest on record. July 22nd, just a week ago, was the hottest day on record, breaking the record set just the day before on July 21st. In June, now we're just talking about a month ago, in June alone, billions of people across 5 continents sweltered under heat waves that broke more than 1,000 temperature records. Right now, as we speak, the Mediterranean is experiencing a massive heat wave that would have been virtually impossible without climate change, according to the World Weather Attribution. This past spring, an extreme heat wave lasting weeks led to severe water shortages and dozens of deaths in Mexico and Central America. This past June, more than 1,300 people died in Saudi Arabia on the Hajj pilgrimage during an extreme heat wave. Earlier this summer, weeks of extreme heat in Pakistan overwhelmed hospitals and led to severe water shortages and frequent power outages. In early July, Japan issued heat stroke alerts across more than half of the country's prefectures. And in my state of Vermont and in Bill's state of Vermont, tragically, and it just breaks my heart, we have seen last year the worst natural disaster, terrible flooding that we have experienced in 100 years. Then on the same day as last year's disaster, we had another one, not as severe, but quite bad. And then just a few days ago, as a result of torrential rain, we have more damage. Bottom line is that anybody who tells you that climate change is not real is not only a total moron, if I may say so, but really endangers the health and well-being of not only our generation, but more importantly, our kids and grandchildren. So having said that, Bill, why don't we just talk a little bit about where we are as a planet right now. I remember reading just a while back in India, the temperatures went up to something like 125 degrees, which for human beings is unsustainable, right?
Yeah, we're at the very edge in terms of human ability to deal with this. You talked about those deaths in the Hajj in Saudi Arabia. When people at the absolute height of their most important experience in their lives, and 1,500 of them dropped dead in a day because the temperature in Saudi Arabia set a record, all-time record that day, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. We swelter in Vermont when it reaches 90 degrees. We think, man, that's hot. Add 30 degrees to that and just try to imagine what the world is like, especially if, like the vast percentage of people on this planet, you have to work outdoors, you know? Um, um, we're right at the edge. Maybe even more importantly, Bernie, we're now doing severe damage to the fundamental systems of the planet. Both poles are melting fast, and we had damaging new evidence this week of how fast the biggest glacier in the Antarctic is disappearing. We had a really terrifying paper yesterday which put a date for the first time on when we can expect the Atlantic currents like the Gulf Stream to shut down or collapse. And the number was 2050 plus or minus 10 years. So we're not talking about, something that's going to happen someday. We're now in the rapids heading right for the brink of the waterfall, and we've got almost no time. This is the part that I think even people who understand that we have a problem, don't quite understand that it's a problem with a time limit. We have so many political things that we deal with our whole lives. We've been talking about national health care as long as you and I have been alive. And someday we will do it, largely thanks to your efforts. And that'll be good because people will stop dying and going bankrupt. But the fact that we delayed for 50 years won't make it harder when we finally decide to do it. Climate change isn't like that. Once you've melted the Arctic, nobody's got a plan for freezing it back up again. So the IPCC has told us cut emissions in half by 2030 to have some hope of staying on those Paris targets. By my watch, 2030 is 5 years and 6 months away. So we've got our work cut out for us now.
All right, I don't want to get too much into the doomsday scenario. It's kind of my personality, but um, what we are seeing now is not only these heat waves and extreme weather disturbances and the implications of warming oceans and Antarctica and so forth. We're also seeing more drought, more flooding, more
Yep.
forest fires as we speak. Right now
Yep.
on the West Coast, terrible forest fires. Texas had the worst forest fire a little while ago than they have ever had. Uh, Bill, I mean, I almost hesitate to raise the bleak subject, but if the world does not get its act together, what is this planet going to look like in 10 years?
The remainder of this century is going to be extraordinarily grim, verging on impossible if we don't get our act together very fast. You could measure this in any number of ways. Let's pick just one. The UN estimates that on a kind of business as usual climate trajectory, we can expect to see between 1 billion and 3 billion climate refugees over the next decades. You're a student of American politics. You know what 1 million refugees turning up on our southern border did to discombobulate our politics and turn it into the ugly mess that it is now. The same thing in Europe. Multiply that by 1,000 or 3,000 and try to imagine what kind of world we're living in. And then
And
do
Bill,
agriculture and then do public health and on and on.
and people are forced to migrate
They have no
from their
choice.
home countries because what? They can't grow crops. There is
Central
no,
America, Central America gets stuck in this cycle of deep drought and then massive fierce hurricanes. Look at a map. It's, right between two huge oceans. So it's exquisitely vulnerable to the rapid increase in the temperature. I mean, the Syrian refugee crisis that discombobulated Europe was set off, the Syrian civil war, historians are now quite clear, was set off in part by the worst drought ever in what we used to call the Fertile Crescent, which drove millions of farmers off their land and into the city, and the Assad administration couldn't deal with it in any way, and things exploded. These are the kind, I mean, the scale of this is hard for people who aren't out around the world a lot to kind of understand. We had that horrible flooding in Vermont last year, and it really was bad as sort of almost impossible to imagine. When it ended, The next week, it started raining in North Africa. And they don't have any of the kind of systems of resilience that we have. The record rain in Libya washed out 2 dams, and then the river roared through the middle of a coastal city and washed 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned in an hour.
Say that again. I didn't, 10,000 people?
10,000 people drowned. And remember, forget Libya, all of Africa, all the continent of Africa has put about 3% of the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere in the atmosphere. I mean, this has nothing to do with them, except that they're the ones
The
getting
victims.
hammered hardest by it. So in a practical sense, and in a moral sense, and in an economic sense, and in a geopolitical sense, and in every possible sense, this is the biggest, most dangerous thing humans have ever done. The good news is that we know more or less what to do. And if we wanted to put our minds to it, we could do it. And that's the one thing that keeps me fighting here.
All right. Let's take a look. Well, why don't we just pick up on your last point? What needs, if you were the
Yeah.
czar of the world, what do we do?
So here's the thing. Climate change is caused 80% or more by burning fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil. We have to stop burning them. We've known that for a long time, but for a long time, it wasn't clear what we could replace them with because we need warm homes and, we might even need a cold beer on a hot day. Now we know. Scientists and engineers in the last decade have driven down the price of renewable energy 90%. Sometime about 3 or 4 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it got cheaper than coal and gas and oil. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power, Bernie, is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. I'm a sometime Methodist Sunday school teacher. That is a water into wine miracle. And if we took full advantage of it, we'd have a chance. Here's the case in point, and I just wrote about this for the New Yorker. California, which hasn't done everything perfectly, but it's done more on this than any other state. California this year has now so many solar panels and so many batteries that for the last 100 days, California has produced more than 100% of its electricity needs for some large portion of each day from renewable energy alone. And when the sun goes down, the batteries that have been soaking up that excess power all afternoon have become the biggest source of supply to the grid. From last year to this year, California just cut its use of natural gas to generate electricity by 40% year on year. That's a big enough number to make a dent in climate change if we could do it everywhere. And California is the fifth largest economy on the earth and arguably the most modern. So if you can do it there, we can run anything off renewable energy. Solar power is a miracle. The same sun that gives us warmth and light and photosynthesis is more than willing to provide the power we need to run our lives. If we can move the fossil fuel industry out of the way, then we can do this and do it fast. The other place we've seen it happening fast is Europe in the wake of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. They have transformed their energy grid in the course of 2 years. They're using less natural gas now than they did 20 years ago. And it's because they've put so much sun and wind on that grid. It's remarkable to see what can happen. Sometimes it makes me even more frustrated that we're not doing it everywhere, most places at the speed we need to, because it's not a question of, what do we do? It's a question of, can we do it over the screaming protest of the fossil fuel industry?
All right. I want to detour to the fossil fuel industry and say that what I think many of our viewers know, that the idea that carbon emissions cause climate change and all of the problems associated with that, this is not a new story. I mean, the industry itself knew this when, in the 50s and the 60s, Bill?
They definitely knew it in detail in the 1980s, back when I was writing that book. The files now people have uncovered demonstrated that Exxon scientists predicted with stunning accuracy what the temperature would be in 2020. Not only did Exxon know it, the executives believed it. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs higher in the 1980s to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. The only thing they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, across this industry, they invested billions to build this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept us locked for 30 years in a completely sterile debate about whether or not global warming was real. A debate, remember, that both sides knew the answer to at the beginning. It's just one of them was willing to lie. And that lie cost us 30 years. It cost us the time it cost us was the most important thing. That's why we have 5 years left to do this task. It would have been hard in 35 years. It's going to be ultra hard. It's going to be Simone Biles level hard to do it in 5 years, to stick that landing. But it's what they're now doing is just as bad. Nobody can deny climate change any longer except Donald Trump. But now these companies and their lackeys are engaged in what you would call solutions denial. They're all on about how, well, it's going to take a long time to make this transition, and so we're going to need natural gas instead of soil, blah, blah, blah. It's because they have trillions of dollars of oil and gas in their reserves. And if we make this transition quickly, then that's worthless. Then it's just a bunch of hydrocarbons under the ground. Our job is to make that transition happen fast. And to do that, we need, among other things, to break the political power of the fossil fuel industry.
Which is not an insignificant political force in Washington, D.C. They bankroll a lot of campaigns. And as you indicated, our former president, Mr. Trump, the one policy idea that came from his speech was drill, baby, drill.
Well,
And
I mean,
here is a guy who tells his supporters that climate change is a hoax created in China, right?
you saw his meeting with the fossil fuel executives. It was sort of an Austin Powers moment. It was like $1 billion and you can do whatever you want with the world. And they're giving him the money because they know that for them, this is a totally crucial election. 4 more years of the momentum that we started building up under the Inflation Reduction Act, and this die will be more or less cast. There's really good work going on in Washington and around the country to get some things done. So they are desperate to put the brakes on it and to delay. They're not going to. I mean, 30 years from now, Bernie, we're going to run the world on sun and wind because it's cheap. But if it takes us anything like 30 years to get there, then the world that we run on sun and wind will be a broken world. Our job is to speed up, catalyze that reaction.
Bill, any thoughts? Not that I want to detour too much away from the substance of what we're talking about, but any thoughts on the part of these executives who know exactly what they're doing, who know that they're lying, who are jeopardizing the well-being of their own children and their grandchildren? Why? I mean, what kind of psyche does that?
Bernie, I mean, it's funny. I got arrested a couple of weeks ago out in front of Citibank in New York, because Citibank's the biggest single funder of the fossil fuel industry. And, I've been led away in handcuffs now a dozen times or so in my life. And each time I do it, I feel sort of stupid. It's like, why on earth am I ending up in the Huskow in order to make people pay attention to physics? Um, I'm afraid that money that there are certain people who have bought into the idea that if they have enough money, they and their offspring will be insulated from whatever comes. And to some degree, it may be a sign of fear about I mean, these people know better than most what's happening. They read these reports all day long. They understand the dilemma. So it's one in a in a world that worked the way that in my Methodist Sunday school teacher heart, I wish it did, a simple appeal to common morality would be enough to produce the change that we need. But I'm an old man now, and I have come to understand that you need sometimes to speak more than truth to power. You need to speak some power to power. And that means doing the kind of organizing that we do at Third Act with people over 60 or at 350.org, we do all over the world. Or, you know, um, um, if we build movements, then we have a chance. And those movements start influencing what happens in Washington and what happens at Citibank and wherever.
Bill, I know that you are one of the founders of 350.org, and you're very proud of the work that young people, not only in the United States, but all over the world, are doing. Um, Talk about, I mean, this would be a difficult enough um, job if it was just the United States. If we had to
Mm,
take on the fossil fuel industry, if we had to
mm.
take on Trump, if we had to take on all of the money that the fossil fuel industry puts into politics and their lobbying and their et cetera, et cetera. But this is not. This is obviously a global issue. And correct me if you think I'm wrong here, but if Trump were to win this election, the word would go out to every country on earth, to China and every other country, that the game is over. You really do not have to transform your energy system because the United States, a major second largest polluter, is not going to do it. Is that pretty right? Or
I think that's absolutely right. Look what happened when Trump won last time. He pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords. Of all the shameful things he did, it's possible that, well, I mean, it's hard to rank, but uh, that's right up there because we're the country that's put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than any other, and nobody, not even China, will ever catch up with us in the historical tables here. And yet, for 4 years, we were the only country in the world, the only country not engaged in the effort to do something about it. If Trump does this again, then it's the great gift to the king of Saudi Arabia, to Vladimir Putin, to the petro oligarchs all over the world who want another few years of business as usual, another few years of record profits. Uh, uh, and and that's why, you know, it's, we've we've gotten Bernie. I mean, it seems like the last 3 or 4 elections, everyone's been the most important election of our lifetime.
yeah.
I hope I live long enough to see an election again that isn't important in my lifetime. But this one really is, and it's why, it's why at Third Act we're all in here working.
Explain third act. Not everybody knows
Sure
what
will.
third act is.
Third Act is for people over 60 who care about climate and the democracy. And we started it 2 years ago, and we've now got big working groups in pretty much every state in the union, and uh, uh, the volunteers who are, writing millions of postcards and making phone calls and knocking on doors and going to jail too, a surprising number of times. The logic is, as you said earlier, that young people have taken rightly the lead in this fight. But I heard too many people my age say, oh, it's up to the next generation to solve these problems, which is not okay. You can't take the biggest problem that the world ever faced and just assign it to high school students for for them to go deal with. They lack the structural power by themselves necessary to make change on the scale that we need in the time that we have. There's no time for them to grow up and become CEOs and senators. So who has structural power? Well, I mean, I said the other day to someone, if you've reached the age where you have hair growing out your ears, then you have structural power coming out your ears too. There's 70 million of us over the age of 60. We punch above our weight because we all vote. There's no known way to stop old people from voting. We ended up with most of the financial resources, fair or not. And so if you want to put pressure on Washington or Wall Street or any state capital, then having some people with hairlines like yours and mine is a useful part of the process. And it's really, really been fun to just see the incredible energy that older Americans are bringing to these fights. Remember, I mean, people used to say, oh, people become more conservative as they age and so on. If you're in your 60s or your 70s or your 80s now, your first act was in that period of extraordinary social, cultural, political transformation. If you have any doubt, look at what the Supreme Court's gone after. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1971, Roe v. Wade 1973. I mean, they're now going after the Declaration of Independence 1775, but be that as it may, this generation of people changed the world and now has to figure out how to defend those changes. And we're completely capable of it. It's been incredibly inspiring to watch people at Third Act join together. And you've been a part of that from the beginning. The very first video that we put out had you and it had Greta Thunberg on it, talking about how we need people of this generation to make their third act their most powerful act. And it's been really powerful
Well,
to watch.
congratulations to you, Bill. I mean, you've gone from organizing young people to organizing older people, and that speaks to what you do. I want to go to another area. Um, right now, historically, the United States has been the major dumper of carbon into the atmosphere. Today it is China. What is your sense of China's feelings about climate and their willingness to act boldly?
As far as I can tell, China has decided that acting on the energy revolution is going to be their strategy for dominance in the 21st century. China's installing, uh, right now, the world is installing a gigawatt of solar panels every day. So that's about a nuclear power plant's worth of solar panels every day. That's about
Wow.
half the pace that we need to be going at, but it's pretty good. It's a big improvement over even a year ago. Half of that is in China. Um, the Chinese are quickly electrifying their economy, moving everything, including automobiles, to electricity so they can provide it quickly. There are a number of reasons for that. You've been to China, you know that the cities were so polluted that it became a real challenge to the political legitimacy of the government. Climate change is an enormous challenge. The Pearl River Delta, their manufacturing base, is a meter above sea level, so they're scared about that. But I think most of all, they understand the strategic significance of moving very fast to own this part of the market. That the green energy transformation is the biggest economic project the world's ever seen. That's why it's good news that the Biden administration at least has been starting to play some catch up here and to bring the US into this game so we don't get shut out. And that's why it's good to see that we've opened, once the IRA money came through, that we've opened battery factories hither and yon, that we're, beginning to manufacture things again in America. And a lot of those things are the clean, green things that we need. But man, do we need that to continue. I gave a talk this morning to community college leaders across America. And I pointed out that if we're going to do what we need to do, in terms of we need 1 million electricians in the next 10 years in this country.
Is that right?
Kids come to me and say, what job should I have to help with saving the world? And, I teach at a liberal arts college, but increasingly I say to kids, if you want a job that really is going to help and is going to guarantee you a good, stable income, become an electrician, man, because boy, do we need them. Learn about HVAC and how to install heat pumps. Figure out, be the guy or the gal who knows how to fix an EV. These are the places where we're going. And it could provide, as it is in China, stable, good, and truly important work for an entire generation of Americans. Because look, Bernie, no one's done a better job than you of understanding why we need a good paycheck. But I know you know too that work isn't just about a paycheck. It's about a sense that you're actually contributing something meaningful to the world around you while you're doing it. That's why teachers and nurses and things are, that's why those are such important and such beautiful occupations. Well, now electrician is the same thing. We can't save the planet without a bunch of them.
All right. On that note, I want to thank Bill. Anything that we have not gone over? Did we touch most of the bases?
I think we touched the bases. Just I know that nobody listening to this is taking anything for granted about November. But
Right.
man, oh man, we've got
All right,
a
let me
little.
just say a word on that. Let me be the politician here. I understand that there are a lot of folks out there who are not happy with the Biden administration, the Harris administration, regarding Gaza, for example. And I share those concerns. We should not be giving another nickel to this right-wing extremist Netanyahu government that is causing one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern American history, modern world history, and we're funding it. But I think what, as Bill has indicated, the stakes are so very high right now that when you have somebody like a Donald Trump, who not only thinks that climate change is a hoax, but is selling out completely to the fossil fuel industry, you're going to have to take a deep breath and decide that if you want a planet that is going to be healthy and habitable for your kids and future generations, not only do you have to vote for Kamala Harris, but you're going to have to organize your friends in your community to do that. This is going to be a very close election. But I think that any serious human being in this country who understands what we have been talking about, and millions of people do, Bill, that if we don't get a handle on climate change, the future of this planet is very, very bleak. You've got to be
We've got
involved.
exactly right. We've got a little head of steam. Let's don't blow it this time.
Good. Okay, on that note, I want to thank my friend, a hero, somebody who does extraordinarily good work, my fellow Vermonter, Bill McKibben. Bill, thanks so much.
Take care, brother. See you soon.
Okay.